Is human consciousness only generated in the brain? Hello everyone. Today we are going to explore one of the most fundamental questions that humanity has been asking itself for thousands of years. Is human consciousness only generated in the brain, or does a deeper dimension exist? This question goes beyond simple curiosity, addressing the core concerns about the essence and identity of our existence. If all our thoughts, emotions, memories, and sense of self are contained within 1.5 kilograms of grey matter, then who and what are we really? Does consciousness disappear when the brain is damaged? Or does consciousness exist in a deeper, more vast dimension beyond the brain? Chapter 1. Consciousness from a scientific perspective. From the perspective of modern neuroscience, consciousness is considered to be the result of complex neural network activity in the brain. It suggests that the conscious experience we call I emerges from the electrochemical signal exchanges between more than 100 billion neurons. What a poetic irony it is to think that our poetic soul, love, faith, and artistic inspiration might ultimately be nothing more than circuits through which electricity flows. With advances in brain imaging technology, scientists have confirmed that specific aspects of consciousness are associated with specific areas of the brain. The frontal lobe is responsible for higher-order thinking and decision-making, the hippocampus for memory formation, and the thalamus for processing sensory information and regulating conscious states. In studies of patients with brain damage, it has been observed that when specific brain regions are damaged, specific aspects of consciousness are also damaged. This suggests that consciousness has at least a deep connection with the brain. However, quantum brain theories, such as the orchestrated objective reduction theory proposed by British physicist Roger Penrose and American anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, suggest that consciousness may be more than simply macroscopic neuronal activity. According to this theory, consciousness may be related to quantum phenomena occurring in structures called microtubules within neurons. If quantum-level phenomena are involved in consciousness, then consciousness could be a much more mysterious and complex phenomenon than the physical processes we previously understood. Additionally, recent studies report cases where brain activity does not perfectly match conscious experience. Near-death experiences, conscious experiences during cardiac arrest, and states of pure consciousness experienced during meditation are phenomena that are difficult to fully explain with standard neuroscientific models. However, it remains difficult to objectively verify these phenomena using scientific methodology, and most mainstream neuroscientists still maintain the position that consciousness arises from brain activity. Perhaps we are standing at the limits of modern science. Can the subjective experience of consciousness be fully explained by objective methodology? This is indeed an ironic question. Chapter 2. Exploring consciousness from a philosophical perspective. The problem of consciousness has occupied an important position in the realm of philosophy as much as in science. Let's look at the main perspectives on consciousness from a philosophical standpoint. First, there is physicalism, or the reductionist perspective. According to this view, consciousness is entirely the function of the physical brain, and consciousness beyond the brain does not exist. It suggests that all our subjective experiences, feelings of free will, and even spiritual experiences are merely byproducts of complex neural activity. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland argue that consciousness can be reduced to physical processes. For them, the mystery of consciousness is simply a brain mechanism that we don't yet fully understand. Second, there is dualism. This perspective, represented by René Descartes, argues that mind or consciousness and matter or brain are fundamentally two different substances. Through his famous proposition, "I think, therefore I am," Descartes argued that the thinking self is a reality separate from the material world. In modern times, philosophers like David Chalmers have raised the hard problem of consciousness, arguing that explaining how subjective experience qualitatively emerges from physical processes is a fundamentally difficult problem. Third, there is idealism. According to this view, advocated by George Berkeley, Immanuel Kant, and others, consciousness or mind is the fundamental reality, and the physical world is derived from consciousness. This perspective suggests that even what we perceive as matter is a construct of consciousness. While this position is somewhat minority in modern philosophy, some contemporary philosophers and physicists are proposing views like panpsychism, suggesting that consciousness may be a fundamental property of the universe. Fourth, there is non-reductive physicalism. This position argues that consciousness is based on physical processes, but cannot be completely reduced to them. Philosophers like John Searle view consciousness as an emergent property arising from brain activity, which depends on physical processes, but cannot be fully explained by the characteristics of those processes. Thus, the philosophical debate continues, and no single perspective provides a complete answer to the nature of consciousness. In fact, these philosophical positions each have plausible logic, but it is difficult to present decisive evidence. Quite ironically, our understanding of consciousness seems to remain as ambiguous as ourselves. After all, we are using ourselves to know ourselves. Chapter 3: Consciousness from Religious and Spiritual Perspectives. Beyond the realms of science and philosophy, the exploration of the nature of consciousness has also occupied an important position in the world's major religious and spiritual traditions. These traditions tend to regard consciousness as something deeper and more enduring than simply a product of the brain. In Eastern religious traditions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, consciousness or mind is seen not as a simple product of the brain, but as part of fundamental reality. In Buddhism, consciousness or mind is seen as existing through the process of reincarnation, teaching that one can ultimately escape the illusion of self through enlightenment. In philosophical traditions of Hinduism, such as Advaita Vedanta, it is argued that individual consciousness, or Atman, is ultimately one with universal consciousness, or Brahman. In Western Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, humans are viewed as created in God's image, with the soul being the essence of consciousness. This soul is believed to persist after physical death and ultimately receive God's judgment. The Bible says in Genesis 2:7, "The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul," suggesting that human consciousness is more than just a material process. But here an interesting irony arises. Modern neuroscience presents evidence that even religious experiences are related to activity in specific parts of the brain, particularly the temporal lobe. This suggests that mystical experiences, deep meditative states, and even the sense of God's presence can be associated with patterns of brain activity. So are religious experiences merely brain activity? Or does the brain act as an antenna, detecting a deeper spiritual dimension? The field of modern neurotheology explores these questions, but definitive answers have not yet emerged. What if our consciousness is related to both neural circuits and spiritual dimensions? This could be an integrative perspective that goes beyond dichotomous thinking. Religious traditions also provide rich records of altered states of consciousness. They say that experiences beyond ordinary conscious states are possible through meditation, prayer, fasting, and various spiritual practices. These experiences sometimes include deep insights, feelings of connection with all things, and sensations that transcend space and time. Among modern consciousness researchers, some argue that these altered states of consciousness may not be simple hallucinations or delusions, but may provide access to deeper dimensions of consciousness. Perhaps the realm of consciousness that religious and spiritual traditions have explored for thousands of years is territory that modern science is only beginning to approach. Or conversely, scientific methodology might help reinterpret and understand religious intuitions. Either way, the exploration of consciousness is undoubtedly an interesting area that promotes dialogue between science and religion. Chapter 4: Modern Debates and New Perspectives on Consciousness. Modern consciousness research is presenting new insights and debates that go beyond traditional scientific, philosophical, and religious perspectives. In this chapter, we'll examine some modern perspectives and debates on consciousness. First, there is the integrated information theory. This theory, proposed by Giulio Tononi, argues that consciousness is closely related to the integration of information. It suggests that the degree of consciousness is determined by how and to what extent a system, namely the brain, integrates this information. From this perspective, consciousness is not simply present or absent, but varies in degree, and could exist to varying degrees in various systems beyond the human brain. Second, there is the global workspace theory. According to this theory, developed by Bernard Baars and Stan Dehaene, consciousness occurs when information is globally broadcast in a workspace shared by various specialized modules of the brain. That is, we experience something consciously when specific information becomes simultaneously accessible across multiple brain regions. Third, there is predictive coding and the free energy principle. According to this perspective, led by Carl Friston, the brain is essentially a prediction machine, and conscious experience emerges in the process of minimizing the difference between these predictions and actual sensory inputs or prediction errors. This perspective attempts to understand consciousness from a computational standpoint. Fourth, there are quantum consciousness theories. In addition to the orchestrated objective reduction theory mentioned earlier, physicists like Henry Stapp argue that principles of quantum mechanics may be important in understanding the nature of consciousness. In particular, characteristics of quantum mechanics, such as non-locality and entanglement, are similar to the integrative properties of consciousness. Fifth, there is the evolutionary perspective on consciousness. If consciousness is a product of natural selection, what evolutionary advantage did it provide? Some theorists argue that consciousness would have played an important role in adaptation and survival in complex environments. Conscious experience may have helped organisms integrate past experiences, predict the future, and coordinate complex social relationships. Sixth, there is the revival of panpsychism. Contemporary philosophers like David Chalmers and Galen Strawson present the view that consciousness may be a fundamental characteristic of the physical world. According to this perspective, consciousness or primitive forms of experience are fundamental properties of the physical world, manifesting as more complex forms of consciousness in complex systems. These modern perspectives are expanding our understanding of the nature of consciousness, but they still don't provide definitive answers. Ironically, the more sophisticated theories of consciousness become, the more questions we face. Consciousness remains the most elusive puzzle, simultaneously the closest thing to us, yet the most difficult to understand. And what's even more ironic is that all these theories and perspectives are ultimately the result of conscious beings, consciously thinking about consciousness. We are trying to understand the very tool we are using to understand it. We are standing before a circular challenge, like an eye trying to see itself. Chapter 5: Clinical Evidence in Borderline Cases. Beyond theoretical discussions about consciousness, actual clinical cases raise interesting questions about the nature of consciousness. In this chapter, we'll look at various phenomena and cases at the boundaries of consciousness. First, there are near-death experiences. Many people who have recovered from cardiac arrest or other forms of clinical death report specific patterns of experience. These include feelings of moving toward a bright light, out-of-body experiences where one feels separated from one's body and looking down from above, meetings with deceased relatives or spiritual beings, and feelings of peace and being welcomed. These experiences show similar patterns worldwide, regardless of cultural and religious background. Interestingly, at this point, brain activity is often minimized or even unmeasurable. This is sometimes used as evidence for the claim that consciousness can exist without brain activity. Second, there are psychosomatic dissociation phenomena. Some people who have experienced severe trauma or stress report feeling separated from their bodies. These dissociative states, where the integrity of the self temporarily collapses, raise interesting questions about the relationship between consciousness and the body. Third, there are cases of patients with consciousness disorders. Patients in various states of consciousness disorders, such as vegetative states, minimally conscious states, and locked-in syndrome, show complex relationships between the degree of consciousness and brain activity. In some studies, patients who outwardly appear unconscious have shown evidence of conscious cognitive activity in functional magnetic resonance imaging. Fourth, there are drug-induced changes in conscious states. Psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT can dramatically change normal states of consciousness. These substances act on specific neurotransmitter systems in the brain, potentially causing dissolution of ego boundaries, changes in perception of reality, and profound spiritual experiences. Recent studies suggest that these drugs appear to reset or expand the brain's basic activity patterns, suggesting that conscious experience may not be limited to specific brain activity patterns. Fifth, there are meditation and changes in conscious states. Long-term meditation practitioners report various experiences beyond ordinary conscious states. These experiences, known as states of pure consciousness or non-dual consciousness, include sensations where the distinction between subject and object disappears and everything feels connected as one. Brain imaging studies have confirmed specific brain activity patterns in these states, but it remains debated whether the subjective quality of the experience can be fully explained by this activity. Sixth, there are collective consciousness or shared consciousness phenomena. Some researchers suggest that in certain conditions, individual consciousness can somehow be shared or connected in some way. Twin telepathy, synchronicity phenomena, and group meditation effects are sometimes interpreted as suggesting this possibility. However, scientific evidence for these phenomena is still limited and controversial. These borderline cases challenge our understanding of the nature of consciousness and suggest the possibility that there may be aspects that cannot be reduced simply to brain activity. However, at the same time, we cannot exclude the possibility that these phenomena could be explained by brain mechanisms that have not yet been discovered. Perhaps a balanced approach between brain-centered perspectives and perspectives considering broader dimensions is needed to understand the nature of consciousness. Chapter 6: Practical Applications and Ethical Implications of Consciousness Research. Beyond theoretical debates about the nature of consciousness, our understanding of consciousness has various practical applications and ethical implications. In this chapter, we'll look at the impact of consciousness research on actual life and society. First, there are medical and therapeutic applications. Understanding the neurological basis of consciousness has important implications for the diagnosis and treatment of patients with coma, vegetative states, and various consciousness disorders. Brain-computer interface technology has allowed people with severe physical disabilities to communicate with the outside world through their thoughts alone. Additionally, mindfulness and meditation-based psychotherapies have proven effective in addressing various mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and addiction through conscious attention. But the ironic point here is that we are developing technologies to manipulate and treat consciousness while not fully understanding its nature. Isn't this similar to 19th century people using electricity without fully understanding its nature? Perhaps future people will laugh at the primitive concepts we had about consciousness. Second, there is the relationship between artificial intelligence and consciousness. As artificial intelligence technology advances, the question, can machines have consciousness, is becoming increasingly important. If consciousness is simply the result of complex information processing, could a sufficiently complex AI system someday have consciousness? This possibility raises deep ethical questions. How should we treat AI with consciousness? Would they have rights? Our understanding of the nature of consciousness will have important implications for answering these questions. Third, there are ethical issues of consciousness-expanding technologies. Psychostimulants, psychedelic substances, brain stimulation technologies, etc., can change or expand states of consciousness. If these technologies become widespread, what impact will they have on the nature of human experience and social relationships? How far should the concept of cognitive liberty, the right to freely change one's conscious state, be allowed? At the same time, there is also the possibility that these technologies could deepen inequality or be used for new forms of control and manipulation. Fourth, there is the issue of free will and moral responsibility. If consciousness is entirely determined by the physical processes of the brain, how should the concept of free will be understood? If our decisions and actions are predetermined by neurological processes, how can the concept of moral responsibility be maintained? These questions have important implications for legal systems, moral philosophy, and social practices. Fifth, there is the expansion of consciousness and spiritual growth. Meditation, yoga, and various spiritual practices seek personal growth and happiness through the expansion and transformation of consciousness. These practices often promote experiences of self-transcendence, connectedness, and presence. As scientific understanding of consciousness deepens, new insights into the value and mechanisms of these traditional practices may become possible. Ultimately, the practical applications of consciousness research require interdisciplinary dialogue, encompassing science, philosophy, ethics, religion, and more. The question of whether consciousness is simply a product of the brain or whether a deeper dimension exists has implications beyond mere academic curiosity, fundamental to how we understand and treat ourselves and the world. Chapter 7. Consciousness as Personal Exploration. So far, we have examined scientific, philosophical, and religious perspectives on consciousness. However, consciousness is ultimately the domain of the most personal experience. In this chapter, we'll look at the value and methods of personal exploration of consciousness. First, there is self-reflection and inner exploration. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Questions about the nature of consciousness ultimately lead to the most fundamental question: who am I? Through various methods such as journaling, meditation, dream analysis, and self-dialogue, we can explore our consciousness more deeply. This self-exploration can help us find meaning and direction in life beyond mere intellectual curiosity. An interesting point here is that the act of observing oneself already presupposes the duality of consciousness. The separation of the I, who observes, and the I, who is observed, shows the reflective nature of consciousness. Ironically, it is impossible to observe oneself completely objectively. This is because the observer always becomes part of what is being observed. It's like trying to see oneself holding the mirror while looking at oneself reflected in it. Second, there is careful observation of changes in everyday consciousness. Our conscious states continually change throughout the day. We experience various conscious states such as wakefulness, drowsiness, immersion, daydreaming, and various stages of sleep. By carefully observing these changes, we can learn much about the spectrum of consciousness and its characteristics. In particular, states just before falling asleep, or hypnagogic states, the boundary between dreams and waking, and states of deep immersion can provide interesting insights into the nature of consciousness. Third, there is the practice of conscious choice and free will. If consciousness is simply an automatic process of the brain, how free are our choices and decisions? Regardless of the answer to this philosophical question, we shape our lives through conscious choices in every moment. The practice of making conscious and intentional choices instead of habitual and automatic responses is a direct way to experience the power of consciousness. As Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space, we have the freedom and power to choose our response. Fourth, there is connection with other consciousnesses. Like Martin Buber's concept of the I and you relationship, a genuine meeting with another consciousness can be an experience that expands the boundaries of consciousness. Through deep conversation, love, empathy, artistic communion, etc., we can transcend the boundaries of the self. These experiences suggest that consciousness may not be simply confined to individual brains, but may have broader relational and social dimensions. Fifth, there is the expression of consciousness through art and creativity. Art often reveals dimensions of consciousness that are difficult to express in language. Through various art forms such as music, visual arts, literature, and dance, we can explore and express the depth and diversity of consciousness. The creative process itself often involves the expansion and transformation of consciousness, and artworks can become shared expressions of consciousness. Personal exploration of consciousness is as important as scientific and philosophical exploration. Perhaps it is even more important. This is because, due to the subjective nature of consciousness, only direct experience can come closest to its essence. Various theories and perspectives on consciousness can be used as maps for this personal exploration. But ultimately, each person must directly experience and understand its essence through their own consciousness. Chapter 8. The nature of consciousness from a biblical perspective. So far, we have explored the nature of consciousness from various scientific, philosophical, and religious perspectives. In this chapter, we'll look at the nature of consciousness specifically from a biblical perspective. The Bible does not directly use the word consciousness, but it provides rich insights into the human mind, soul, and heart. The most fundamental starting point in the Bible is Genesis 1:26-27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. This passage suggests that humans are more than mere material beings. As beings created in God's image, humans have consciousness, self-awareness, moral judgment, creativity, and free will. These characteristics can be seen as core aspects of consciousness. Genesis 2:7 describes the creation of humans in more detail. The Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Here, the concept of a living being, or nefesh chaya, represents the integration of body and soul. From a biblical perspective, humans exist not as dualistically separated body and soul, but as an integrated whole. Consciousness can be seen as a core aspect of this integrated being. 1 Corinthians 2:11 implies the self-aware nature of consciousness. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. This passage says that the spirit within a person, or pneuma, is the only being that can know their own thoughts and experiences. This implies the subjective, first-person perspective of consciousness. Romans 12:2 suggests the possibility of changing consciousness. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Here, the renewal of the mind, or anakenosis to nous, implies spiritual growth through the change and expansion of consciousness. The Bible also presents the view that consciousness transcends merely the function of the brain. Ecclesiastes.says, says, "The dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." This passage suggests that the spirit, or ruach, persists after the death of the body. What is the relationship between the biblical perspective and the modern, scientific, and philosophical perspectives we've examined? An interesting point here is that the Bible presents an integrative perspective that transcends both simple dualism and physicalist reductionism. Humans are both physical beings and spiritual beings, and consciousness arises in the complex interaction of these two dimensions. In fact, the close relationship between brain and consciousness, discovered by modern neuroscience, does not contradict the Bible's integrative view of humans. The fact that the brain provides the physical basis for conscious experience does not exclude the possibility that consciousness is connected to a deeper spiritual dimension. Just as a radio receives radio waves, the brain might be a tool that receives consciousness from a deeper spiritual dimension. From a biblical perspective, perhaps the most important insight about consciousness concerns its purpose and direction. Consciousness is not simply a tool for survival, but is given for relationship with God, love for neighbors, and stewardship of the created world. The greatest commandment in Matthew 22:37-39. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself presents the ultimate orientation of consciousness. In conclusion, the Bible provides important insights into the origin and nature of consciousness. Consciousness is not simply a biological product of the brain, but a core aspect of human existence, created in God's image, a mysterious phenomenon that integrates the material and spiritual dimensions. This perspective can add depth and meaning to modern exploration of the nature of consciousness. Chapter 9. Toward an integrative perspective. Conclusion. So far, we have explored various perspectives on the nature of consciousness. We have examined what consciousness is and whether it is simply a product of the brain, or whether a deeper dimension exists, from scientific, philosophical, religious, and personal dimensions. Now let's think about how these various perspectives can be understood integratively. First, consciousness is a multidimensional phenomenon. It may be incomplete to understand consciousness either by simply reducing it to neural activity in the brain, or conversely, as a purely non-material phenomenon. Consciousness is a complex phenomenon where biological, psychological, social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions all intersect. An integrative perspective that acknowledges and respects this multidimensional nature is needed. Second, thinking that transcends the dichotomy between science and religion, matter and mind, is needed. Scientific research and spiritual exploration of consciousness are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they can complement and enrich each other. Romans 1:21 in the Bible, which says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened," points out the limitations that occur when knowledge and spiritual understanding are separated. Third, questions about the nature of consciousness are ultimately connected to questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. If consciousness is simply a product of the brain, what ultimate basis can our experiences, choices, values, and meanings have? Conversely, if consciousness is connected to a deeper spiritual dimension, what greater purpose and direction might our existence have? The Bible says in Acts 17:28, "For in him we live and move and have our being," finding the origin and purpose of human existence in God. Fourth, exploring the nature of consciousness requires humility and wonder. Consciousness is one of the most directly experienced, yet most difficult to understand mysteries. Despite all the insights of science, philosophy, and religion, there remain unsolved puzzles in the nature of consciousness. Acknowledging this wonder reflects the spiritual humility that the psalmist sings in Psalm 8:3-4. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them?" Fifth, our understanding of consciousness has practical implications for how we should live. Whatever consciousness is, we experience the world, make choices, and form relationships through it. So how can we live a deeper and more meaningful conscious life? The Bible suggests in Proverbs 4:23, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it," indicating that the quality and direction of consciousness determine the quality of life. In conclusion, there may not be a single answer to the question of whether human consciousness occurs only in the brain or whether a deeper dimension exists. But the process of exploring this question itself expands and deepens our consciousness. From a biblical perspective, consciousness is a core aspect of human existence created in God's image, a mysterious gift that integrates the material and spiritual dimensions. As the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13:12, "For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." Our understanding of the nature of consciousness is the same. It may be partial and dim now, but someday we may reach a more complete understanding. Until then, we must continue to explore, learn, and grow with humility and wonder. And above all, it will be important to realize our calling in this world by loving God and neighbors more deeply through this amazing gift of consciousness given to us. Closing words. Thank you sincerely for joining me on this long journey into the nature of consciousness today. We have explored various areas, from the relationship between brain and consciousness, philosophical perspectives, religious understanding, the value of personal exploration, to biblical insights. It is impossible to fully cover this complex and profound topic in one audiobook, but I hope this journey serves as a starting point for your own deeper exploration of your consciousness and existence. Questions about consciousness go beyond mere academic curiosity, connecting to fundamental questions about who we are and how we should live. One of the messages the Bible conveys is that we are more than mere material beings. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Our consciousness, our existence, has a deeper purpose and meaning. Although modern science has revealed much about the relationship between brain and consciousness, the fundamental nature of consciousness remains a mystery. Perhaps this is intentional. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end." Within us is a heart that longs for eternity, a consciousness that seeks something beyond the material world. The question of whether consciousness is simply a product of the brain, or whether a deeper spiritual dimension exists, is ultimately a journey that each of us must personally explore and find answers to. However, the Bible provides a clear direction. In John 14:6, Jesus said, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life." This suggests that true consciousness, true enlightenment, true self-understanding is ultimately found in relationship with the Creator. Understanding the nature of consciousness has practical implications beyond mere intellectual satisfaction for how we should live. Romans 12:2 exhorts, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." The change and expansion of consciousness should lead not to simple self-development, but to a change in life according to God's will. As we conclude our journey, the ultimate answer about the nature of consciousness may be found in an integrative understanding of various perspectives. When scientific insight, philosophical thinking, and spiritual wisdom come together, we may reach a more complete understanding of consciousness. And at the center of this is the teaching of the Bible. We are beings created in God's image, and our consciousness is an amazing gift given to know, love, and serve Him. Thank you sincerely for listening to this audiobook to the end. I hope this content has been of some help in your conscious journey. If you want more spiritual and intellectual exploration, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. The Book of How-To channel provides content on various topics connecting consciousness, spirituality, psychology, and biblical wisdom. A richer conversation can continue if you share your thoughts through subscriptions, likes, and comments. I wish God's wisdom and peace for your journey. Thank you.